occurred. Many of you have enrollments that have occurred with this grant, but we expect it to be quite heavy starting next month in January, especially with a new semester. So we wanted to do this now to catch you before we got too far in the enrollment, so we can talk through and explain things and answer any questions. I had scheduled the webinar for today, instead of November, for example, setting it up in December, because I wanted to wait until we heard more from DOL. They were going to be having a meeting with all of the states, the Quest grantee states. And I wanted to be able to incorporate that information that we learn into the webinar. Unfortunately, they haven't had it yet, so it'll be next week. I will get back in touch if there's anything that I share with you today that needs to be updated, expanded on, revised, that type of thing. So right now, this is the information that we are moving forward with in terms of the guidance and direction in operating your Quest grant. So moving on to the agenda, I also want to explain that with this PowerPoint, at first I started kind of taking what I had in October for the webinar and then pulling things out and just setting something up for today with updates. And then I realized you shouldn't have, to be referring back and forth to multiple PowerPoints. So what you're going to see, a lot of this is what you saw in October when we had the webinar, but I've added to it, changed things up a little bit. So this might look very familiar, but it is a new updated PowerPoint for implementation of the Quest project. So you can see there what today's agenda is. And towards the end, you'll see where Jim Potts is going to be joining us. And then we'll have a chance also for questions and answers. Questions and our responses. Anyway, if we go to the next screen, the grant information, everybody has a grant by now. It is through September of 2024. The one thing I want to stress is that with this grant, under participants, we're talking about everybody in this grant has to meet one of the eligibility criteria, which means they have to be a dislocated worker or one of the alternative eligibility criteria. So first is that everybody does have to meet one of those eligibility criteria. We'll talk more about that later. And then secondly, they also have to be from an underserved or historically marginalized group or community. So always be sure to evaluate with this person, not only are they eligible for the grant, but they are a part of the targeted population. And the other thing I want to stress from this screen is that you must follow your local policies. So if you're providing OJTs, work experience, ITA, supportive services, whatever it is, you do need to follow your local policies. There aren't exceptions made. We can't deviate and come up with our own policies, guidelines, dollar amounts for the DWG grant. So just make sure you're following your local policies. Okay, we can go to the next screen then. And the project goals, this is nothing new. This was part of the previous, but I just want to mention overall, this is with DOL, when they put out funding and a funding notice for new funds, DWG funds, they always have a project emphasis, something that they're wanting this particular project to target. So what I tried to do here is to lay out some of the things for this particular Quest project DOL is emphasizing. So it is a matter of, because of COVID, and the COVID is the disaster that we're addressing here with this particular disaster grant, that we're wanting people to be able to enter, return to, or advance in high quality jobs. And also another emphasis is the emphasis on the business engagement, elevating equity and connecting job seekers with high quality jobs. As we talked about before, high quality jobs is repeatedly stressed by DOL. And then the other reminder and an emphasis of DOL is that this project is not a standalone project for you. It is a matter of aligning it with other state and local priorities, strategic priorities, resources, and programs. So as you operate this grant, this project, it is to be operated, and aligned with your other strategic priorities. And The other thing is a focus on returning dislocated workers and other eligible individuals to sustainable, quality, family supporting employment. Moving on to the next screen, the eligible participants. Let me get that. So with the eligible participants, again, I'm stressing here, the first part of this is that a person has to be a part of disaster recovery eligibility. So that list there of 4, a dislocated worker, long-term unemployed defined by the state, temporarily or permanently laid off because of COVID, and self-employed, unemployed now or significantly underemployed because of COVID. That's who is eligible for the grant. And then part 2 is making sure that the person is part of the historically marginalized group or community. Something to stress, and Jim will stress this too, is the first thing is to try to make someone eligible as a dislocated worker. If they aren't eligible as a dislocated worker, then you can use one of the other 3 criteria that are listed there. But the first is to try to make them eligible as a dislocated worker, certify them as an eligible dislocated worker. Okay, going to the next screen, the co-enrollment. I did want to address that you can co-enroll participants in this grant. If you enroll somebody into this grant and then down the road, for whatever reason, you want to co-enroll them in another grant, you know, the 1D formula, for example, you can definitely do that. Your case notes always need to explain what it is you're doing. But the reverse can be done. And that's the, so my point here is participants can be co-enrolled or co-funded, you know, funding coming out of different grants, if there's a benefit or a reason for doing that co-enrollment. In other words, training is a good example that you might have. That's what the first bullet point is. If co-enrolling a current 1D client into the Quest grant, it should be done at the next logical break in service, meaning, for example, the next semester's training. And that co-enrolled clients, if you've got a 1D client who you're wanting to add to this grant and pay for the training, maybe starting in January, you can do that. Definitely have case notes explaining that and showing also that they're a part of the underserved, historically marginalized population. A person may be eligible for 1D and getting services, but they also need to, when enrolled in this grant, the Quest grant, they need to be part of underserved, historically marginalized. So be sure to show that in the case notes. The next bullet point is a reminder that with the Quest DWG grant, everybody has to have at least one career service associated with the Quest grant. And so an example with the 1D is you've got somebody who's a 1D client, and you start paying for their training and maybe also the associated supportive services out of the Quest grant. Let's say that's going to start in January. You have to have at least one career service recorded from the Quest grant. I point that out because if they're co-enrolled, you're probably going to have them in 1D career services, and maybe you've already done the IEP development, the career counseling, case management, you know, you've done a lot of that with 1D. But now that they're in Quest, they also need to have at least one career service associated with the Quest grant. So bottom line is, if you have 100 participants, you're going to have 100 people enrolled into career services also. And then my point there is, at the time of co-enrollment, I just mentioned this, you do need to have a case note explaining how the client meets the underserved, historically marginalized criteria. That's for every participant, whether they're only enrolled in this grant or if they're co-enrolled and they start out as 1D. At some point, they need to have the case note describing their situation and how they meet that criteria. Okay, moving on to the next screen, underserved and historically marginalized. We keep stressing that, and that is the emphasis of the grant. There's a lot of information here, but I just wanted to have it easy to access. You know, you might wonder, well, what does it mean to be underserved and historically marginalized? The first bullet point refers you to your grant application. Back in, I don't even remember when it was, August maybe, that you submitted a grant application to DCEO and you identified who your target population was. who's the underserved and historically marginalized that you're going to be serving. That was item 4 in the application. So take a look at that. But I did want to point out you're not limited to that. So for example, back in August, if you said we're going to be serving justice impacted individuals, disabled, low income, basic skills deficient, that's fine. Do serve those individuals, but you can also serve other populations that are underserved and historically marginalized. I think it's just important for you to be aware of what you told us you were going to be doing. So that's why I suggest going back to grant application item number 4 in terms of what your target population is. So each LWIA determines who in their community is the underserved and historically marginalized population. You're most familiar with your community. You know who's being underserved. So it is part of your project and project to design. You'd be laying that out to us in the various reports talking about your particular communities and who that population is. But I did want to share with you some of the information that we have about these populations. DOL does provide a definition in the Quest-Tegel about historically marginalized, and it lays it out there that they're groups of people who've been excluded from full participation in mainstream educational, economic, cultural, social, and political and political activities. And then they give examples, not limited to these, but the examples include groups that are excluded due to race, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, physical ability, language, and immigration status. So that's just examples of who they have listed as far as historically marginalized. And then I wanted to point out at the same time as we're running this grant, a year ago, we got a career DWG grant that also targets historically marginalized. In that one, we had to tell DOL specifically in Illinois, who is it that's part of the historically marginalized population. So what I've done is listed there is, I've listed the various populations that in the career grant, we are targeting. We didn't have to do such a thing with the Quest grant with DOL. We did not give DOL a list saying these are the underserved and historically marginalized groups we're going to be serving in this grant. We didn't limit ourselves that way. So I just wanted to share with you those two lists of some examples of historically marginalized and underserved. I did want to point out that you are going to be reporting the demographics, the characteristics of who you're serving. In your quarterly reports or monthly reports, you're going to be showing that to demonstrate that you're serving the target population. The bullet point below that then talks about, as you're doing enrollment, be sure to record a participant's, a client's various characteristics and barriers as you go through that enrollment process. So you can capture their demographics. That information does appear in your target population report. And so as we run those and as you run those, it will be very helpful to summarize, to see who it is that you're serving with this pot of money. The other thing I noted there was include these details in a case note. Again, going back to the case notes explaining who it is that you're serving. So sharing those characteristics and barriers in the case notes. Okay, moving on to the next screen. One of the items that was listed under DCEO's career DWG is that we had explained in that grant that part of the underserved and historically marginalized populations included qualified census tract residents and disproportionately impacted area residents. So this next screen, I've keyed in on that because we are going to do counts of that. We're going to have you to report to us how many people of each of those categories you have enrolled. So qualified census tract is explained there. I gave an example where we plugged in a participant's address was plugged into the link is there for it. You plug in the participant's address and then this appears, location qualifications. Both of them are done there. The first one is the qualified census tract, yes or no. And that basically there's an explanation of who is in what census tracts are included there. And it does talk about poverty rate is at least 25%, et cetera. The second one is disproportionately impacted area. Again, you don't enter a separate address. It's not a separate process. All this information comes up together. But this ties into COVID and maybe some of the areas that were disproportionately impacted by COVID. So it looks at the positive per capita rates of COVID and then also some poverty information, poverty data. So there's a yes or no for that also. So with each of your participants, if they're only in the Quest grant, if they're co-enrolled in another grant, be sure to look them up, through this link, enter their address, and then you'll see in the monthly report where we're going to be asking you, okay, you've served 100 participants. How many of them are part of the qualified census tract? You might say 40. How many are disproportionately impacted area? You might say 52. So I just want to let you know now, as you're gearing up, starting your enrollment, some have started enrollments, but anyway, be sure to grab this link, make sure your staff has this link, they look up the addresses, and then they track, count, set up a spreadsheet. I know some people set up spreadsheets to capture various data elements of the people you're serving this grant, if you're serving 30, 50, whatever you're serving, various data elements that you want to capture, but this is one of them, because we're going to have you report then on the number of people from each of those populations. The other population, let me back up for a second. The other thing we're going to have you reporting on, and I guess I've got a screen later on this, is we do want to know, out of the participants that you've served, for example, 100, you served 100 people, how many of them are 1D certified? They're eligible as a dislocated worker. So in the report, you might say, today we've served, through today, we've served 100 people, and 87 of them are 1D certified. That'll give us an idea then of how many people in the Quest grant are 1D certified versus how many then are in the grant because they meet one of the alternative criteria. So that's a heads up too, to be, in the monthly report, you're going to be reporting on that number. How many of your participants are 1D certified? Okay, moving on to the next screen. I'm not going to go into a lot of explanation on these eligibility screens because that's what Jim is going to do. These are screens I had in the past, the previous webinar. And so I won't go into much detail. The one thing I wanted to emphasize is I've got on these screens for eligibility, I've underlined disaster, because it's a reminder that the only reason we're able to use these criteria is because it's a disaster grant. It's not all DWG grants have these extra criteria. For example, employment recovery grants, like a COVID one that many of you are wrapping up now. It's not a disaster grant. It's a employment recovery DWG grant. So I'm emphasizing with each one of these screens, I've underlined the word disaster to just remind you this criteria is only because this is a disaster grant. So you'll see there, the long-term unemployed is defined for disaster grants. This is not the BLS definition of long-term unemployed. And I know it gets confusing when we throw about the term long-term unemployed. There's the BLS of 27 weeks or more, and then there's disaster long-term unemployed. So anyway, we'll move on to the next screen. And disaster eligibility. This next one is laid off due to COVID. So with this one, the Quest grant is a COVID grant. That is the disaster. That is the reason for the grant, is because of COVID. So whenever, in this case, you're talking about the eligibility, is that somebody was temporarily or permanently laid off as a consequence of the disaster or emergency. The disaster is COVID. So in this particular plate example, we've got lists of what does that mean to be laid off because of COVID. So we've got lots of examples. In 6 months, for example, if heaven forbid, you had to have a flood grant or a tornado grant, that would be, it would not be a COVID grant. It would be a tornado grant, or it would be a flood grant. It's grant specific. The disaster is grant specified, what the disaster is. And so we would have other examples for what does it mean to be laid off due to a flood? What does it mean to be laid off due to a tornado? And give, we can give examples of that. But for purposes of the quest, we provided these examples, and this is what's due to COVID. It's quite broad, as you'll see, but when we think back to 2020, when all of this started, things were pretty crazy back then, and there was a lot of people leaving their employment for many reasons, many of them listed here. And I do want to thank the LWIAs that shared their thoughts, ideas on how we might expand our disaster eligibility, because some of this came from you guys in terms of suggestions on how to define disaster eligibility. So moving on to the next screen. The next category for disaster eligibility is, we'll move on to the next one, which is self-employed. And with that one, it's basically that they're self-employed and became unemployed or significantly underemployed as a result of COVID. And we've given an example there of what it means to be significantly underemployed if you are a self-employed individual. I know that doesn't get used much, but if you ever need to refer to it, you've got the information there as to being self-employed but underemployed. Okay, moving on to the services. The employment and training services, the grant is very similar to 1D in that what you're doing is you're providing comprehensive employment training services consistent with your local policies. So like I said, you're operating it very similar to your 1D. The one thing you always need to be reminded of is that this is targeting underserved and historically marginalized. That's who's in this grant. With your 1D grant, you don't need to pay attention to that. With this grant, you do. So we've just listed there the career services, training, supportive services, including needs-related payments and follow-up. So just make sure all your services are provided consistent with your local policies, that you're documenting them well. And, some of the things I'm bringing up just because my thoughts are on some DOL monitoring. And that is with training services, making sure that you've got case notes explaining or addressing the person's capability for success in that. How you determine that. That's the other thing, I guess, with all of these services, it's a matter of, okay, why are you putting them in that? Just having a case note explaining, the process in putting them into a training service. How was that decided? Why is that necessary? That kind of thing. So it's just a matter of thorough case notes for all of the services that are provided. Moving on to the next screen, the case notes, that's, I guess, what I was getting to here with this next screen. It's the thorough case notes are required for the DWG grants. The initial case note does need to explain the circumstances as to how the person is eligible as a dislocated worker or one of the other 3 categories. So, what's their circumstance? Why are they eligible? And then secondly, go on to explain how they meet the underserved or historically marginalized requirement, just a description of who they are. They're a homeless veteran, et cetera, justice impacted. That's one of the categories that is used a lot that you guys are targeting. Who has a disability, anyway, explain that in your own words, the circumstance of that person. The other caution is don't use a cut and paste generic description for your case notes. Make sure it's, customized for who the client is. Tell the story, which is the next bullet point in terms of their eligibility for the grant, but also service determination, assessment, suitability, the delivery of services, also including case notes about periodic review and update of a participant's IEP, of their supportive services needs, because that does change, and we want to see that there's case notes explaining that and showing that that is periodically being reviewed and addressed. Moving on to the next slide, the project activities, targeted participant outreach. These next few slides are dealing with project activities, and it is a matter of some of DOL's project emphasis. So with this, it is a matter of each of you have your target population, individuals with various barriers to employment, challenges to employment. So it is a matter of having a focused outreach campaign to reach the target population. And so that's, in your reporting, that's some of the information you're going to be sharing with us. DOL in particular wants to see what the outreach efforts are in targeting the group, the populations you're reaching out to, the hard to serve populations. The next screen is project activities related to strategic partnerships. And so it's recognized as you defined your particular underserved and historically marginalized communities, that's likely to result in having some expanded partnerships, maybe some partnerships you hadn't had before. I'm thinking of an LWO who was targeting the homeless or at risk of homeless. And so now they've got a long list of various homeless shelters, homeless advocates, homeless, agencies impacting homeless communities. So that's an example of expanding your strategic partnerships, recognizing who it is that you're targeting, and then looking to see, what groups, agencies can assist you with this project in reaching those individuals and providing comprehensive services, and on a continuous basis, then continuing to identify their need. I'm thinking of the homeless group in particular, where they have some very significant challenges, and it is a matter of, on an ongoing basis in their case, it seems day to day or week to week, that their situations change, and it is a matter of staying on top of it. So the strategic partnerships can be very beneficial in helping you be successful in serving the populations, the targeted populations. The next screen is business engagement activities. And this was another strong emphasis of DOL's with this project. So that's something you are going to be reporting on. And I just shared there, what that looks like in terms, you're not just working with businesses to help them find workers, but sharing information on the value and business benefits, increasing job quality and equity, support in creating or expanding high quality jobs. And then the point we've discussed before about IWIB's Business Engagement Committee, that they're very active and are periodically providing recommendations, guidance, strategies related to business engagement activities. So we want you to be aware of that and incorporate those where it makes sense, where it's appropriate for you to do so. They've, like I said, they've got various recommendations and guidance. And so it's good that we stay on top of that and incorporate it as appropriate. Okay, moving on to the disaster relief employment component. With that, it is an optional component, and many of you are not doing this piece. However, you can add it to your grant if you decide to. The disaster relief is the temporary jobs that people go out and work in the community to help with disaster, COVID recovery, COVID mitigation. The examples there are having to do with, we list contact tracing, which is pretty much over, but vaccination assistance, COVID mitigation. When I talk about vaccination assistance, that one that could be not only helping with a clinic, for example, or making the calls or educating people, educating the community about COVID vaccinations. So the DRE component is very much targeted to assist the community by having COVID specific jobs to help with, getting a community through COVID, to mitigate the effort, to mitigate COVID and to respond. So I'm not going to go into detail right now, because if anybody wants to participate in this component and you want to add it, please go ahead and contact me. You can send me an email or call me and we can talk through that if you're wanting to add it. The next screen has to do with COVID job descriptions. And I'm not saying that these are advancing, so let me see if it's something I can do. Okay, well, hopefully we'll get that. Oh, okay. So we finished that screen and moving on to COVID job descriptions. With that, the job descriptions, I'm working with the LWIAs that are doing the DRE piece, and it is just a matter of having a specific COVID job description, laying out the COVID tasks that are to be done, and it isn't a an ongoing, it's not a stock job description that is just updated to include a few COVID tasks. It is specifically a COVID job. The next screen is disaster relief employer, and that just addresses the fact that with these locations, we've got, we need to make sure that the costs charged by a disaster relief employer comply with statute and regulations, and that any negotiations, pricing, and any fees contained in a contract have to be reasonable and fair, and competition is full and open, and you need to follow your local procurement policy. And what comes to mind with that sometimes is using staffing agencies for these DRE jobs. And so again, I think the LWE is doing this, understand that well, and I'd be glad to share this information with anybody who's going to be adding DRE to their grant. Participant wages. The only thing, and I think I pointed this out before, this is consistent with how this has been operated for a long time, except that they did bump this up in terms of looking for at least $15 an hour. So when you talk about disaster relief employer wages, it does need to be in line with the industry standard for that type of work. It is something that's to be evaluated. It's unlike paid work experience, where paid work experience, you might have a standard, everybody gets $11, everybody gets $12. With DRE, you have to pay what's appropriate for that specific type of work. So make sure it's consistent with the industry standard, and it's at least $15 an hour. The DRE health and safety, I don't really need to go into that. That's pretty standard for those DRE jobs. Moving on to grant modification. I'm just bringing this, I just wanted to lay some of these things out now. So as the project progresses, we're 6 months down the road or something, and you're wondering about grant modification. We would be doing that if we need to increase your funding amount, decrease the funding. We need to realign the budget. We need to move money between the cost categories, the line items, alter participant goals, or to add the disaster relief employment component. If you're thinking that you're needing to decrease funds, that you're not going to be able to fully spend 100% of your grant funds, then that's something you do need to stay on top of the project every month, and you do report every month. But my point with this is that you do need to go ahead and let me know in a monthly report 2 or 3 months out that, hey, we're behind in our expenditures, and it looks like we might have to deobligate some funds. So giving me the heads up that you might need to be deobligating funds. The other thing is true too, increasing funds. If things are going well and you're thinking, hey, we could use additional funds if they become available, put that in your monthly report too. The monthly report then could also talk about realigning the budget. Hey, it looks like, I need to add more money to the ITAs. We've got too much maybe in work-based training. I need to realign the budget. So the monthly report is where you communicate what is coming up in the upcoming months, not after the fact, not, right when it's needed, but kind of in advance. Hey, this is what it's looking like. Okay, moving on to the next slide, budget flex. This is the same as what I presented before. The budget flex just lays out the flexibility that you have with the budget, your budget. The priority is the direct training, work-based training, disaster relief, wages and fringes, and supportive services. So you do have 20% flex with those, meaning you can go over those budget line items by up to 20%. Of course, that means you need to go under in your other budget lines. There's 10% flex associated with program and personnel, wages, benefits. And then there's no flex related to the admin. Fiscal obligations. This is something I do want to stress on the next screen, is that with this Quest grant, we do need for you to report in GRS every month what your obligations are. I did mention it there, ITAs and work-based training. Those are the two. We don't need to know what program staff is going to be paid in the next month. We don't need to know that information as an obligation. It's ITAs and work-based training, the work-based training being OJTs, paid work experience. That's what we're seeing. If you're also doing needs-related payments, we would want to see that. But the point is, these costs in the Quest grant, these costs are so significant. They're such a huge part of our project that if there's a lag, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months in getting those reported into GRS, that they're not reported as expenditures, it really throws our reporting off to DOL in showing the progress we were making. In other words, you might have $300,000 in ITAs and OJTs that aren't showing up, even though you've committed those, you've expended them in some cases, but we're not reporting those to DOL. So you do need to show in GRS, updating it every month, screen 377, the obligations for ITAs and work-based training. It's also going to be a part of your Quest monthly status report, where you'll be reporting the obligations. And again, it's just a critical piece for us to be able to tell DOL, yes, our expenditures may be low, but once we factor in the obligations, it shows a different story. It tells a different story. Okay, moving on to the next screen. Project management and oversight. This is the same as before, basically saying that we do expect strong management and oversight of the project to ensure that you've got steady progress. Month by month by month, we should see steady progress in meeting enrollment goals in your various service categories, ITAs, work-based training, but also in your expenditures. And if you're not making good progress, then we look to you to internally, meet with staff and figure it out and determine what needs to be done to get on track. So the other part of that is, if you are having challenges, issues, questions, you need to let us know that you might have to turn money back in. Again, in your monthly status report, go ahead and include that in that last section about comments. Don't hesitate to pick up the phone or send me an email at any time, but the monthly status report is a good opportunity to share some of those things that are going on. The reporting bullet point really just lays out the various reports you'll have to do. Your usual quarterly reports, in this case, go to Lorraine Wareham, and then the others that I'm going to talk about more in just a minute are quarterly, weekly, that type of thing. So if we go to the next screen, the periodic reporting, I just wanted to explain what that is. Weekly, we have to just let DOL know what's going on with the project in terms of enrollment. So starting January 4th, every Wednesday, shoot me an email just saying, with Quest grant enrollments to date are X number. And then later that day, I'm going to share that with DOL, but I'm looking for most up-to-date enrollments. So go ahead and just shoot me a quick email. The next one is monthly status report, to be sent to me by the 30th of every month. And I'm going to be sending you a template for that. But the first report is going to be due January 30th. But that contains information. Most of you, I think, have done these, but it's about enrollment and expenditure, shows how you're progressing. There's narrative that explains things. Now, some examples of some new items that we're going to be adding to the monthly status report is we are going to be asking you, and I did mention this a few minutes ago, we do want you to report on the number of participants that are certified as 1D eligible. So again, the report will say, hey, to date, we've served 100 people. And then you'll be saying 87 of those are 1D certified. The other thing you're going to be reporting is the number of participants enrolled in other titles. So if you've got people co-enrolled in other title, you'll see it on the monthly status report, what we're collecting. I'm just trying to give you a heads up of the data we're trying to collect so we can better understand what's going on with the project. Another data point is the number of participants residing in qualified census tract and number residing in disproportionately impacted area. We went over those screens a few minutes ago, but again, heads up that if you can build in your tracking, if you set up a spreadsheet or whatever it is, that's the information we're going to need to know for each participant. Are they in one of those, are they in the qualified census tract? Is the participant in a disproportionately impacted area? And then again, there's the reminder of where you, the link for where you insert a participant's address. The quarterly narrative performance report is due at the end of the month following the quarter. And so the first report we're going to have you do is for the March 31st quarter. So it'll be all your activity through March 31st. And it's going to be due by May 1st because April 30th is a Sunday. And then I just indicated some points there of what DOL is in the quarterly reports, and we're going to probably learn more in the upcoming meeting. But they've already told us about the quarterly narrative reports. These are the things that they're going to be interested in hearing from you about. Your underserved and historically marginalized enrollment, your equity strategies, addressing client barriers to employment, and specifically because this is a hard to serve population, what's being done to address their barriers, targeted industries, business engagement, virtual services, supportive services, and high quality jobs. Okay, and then performance. The only thing I will say with that is that all project participants are included in your local dislocated worker performance. So if you've got 100 participants in this Quest grant, everybody's going to be in your dislocated worker performance. If they're co-enrolled, they're already in 1D anyway. The only exception has to do with DRE participants, and I'm not going to go into detail because the LWIAs doing DRE understand the exception for their DRE clients, their temporary jobs, their temporary workers. Public communication statement. I want to stress this next slide just because, and we talked about this last time, but in these early phases, you're doing the startup activities, which means you're doing outreach, you're doing maybe job postings, but make sure you have a statement on all of those public facing documents, anything that the public would see about this Quest project, include the required statement. And at the bottom of the slide, Kirsten, if you could advance the slide, please. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see an example of something. And in this case, the LWIA's Quest grant, it's 100% funded with federal funds. There's no other non-governmental sources. So an example could be the Quest DWG project is funded 100% by U.S. Department of Labor federal funds, federal grant funds totaling $450,000. No part of the program is financed by non-governmental sources. You can come up with your own statement, but I know some have asked, well, what does that look like? What does all that language mean? What do they want? So take a look at your job postings, your outreach materials, and just press releases. Make sure you've got this disclosure, required disclosure included. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jim, since he's joined us. And Jim, let's see. Are you there? If not, Jim, go ahead and jump in if you're there. Otherwise, I do see we've got some chat questions.
Hello, Jim Potts here. Can you hear me?
Okay, Jim, why don't you go ahead and while you're presenting, I'm going to go ahead and look at some of these questions because I think you're going to be addressing some of these with your presentation. So thanks for joining us, Jim.
Oh, you're welcome. Kirsten, are you going to bring up my PowerPoint for me, please? Excellent. Are you driving for me or am I able to drive?
I think I am. I don't believe you're.
Okay, no problem.
Yep.
All right. Let's go ahead and move forward because I think it's a 2:30 end, isn't it? So what this PowerPoint is, it's just a truncated version with some additions to the one I emailed out back at the end of November. So next slide, please.
Jim, I'm sorry. We have until 3 o'clock, I believe, right, Jill?
Oh, okay. Well, good.
Yes, that's right.
Well, I won't take up all that time, so but that's good information. I'm glad to hear that. So
thanks, Kirsten.
before we get into what I'm going to speak about, I do want to highlight that before we get into details, there's an emphasis, of course, to serve those individuals in the priority target population of underserved, historically marginalized individual group community. I know Jill's probably already hit on that. So during this presentation, we'll highlight some of those where they're captured within IWDS. And then also you'll see I'm stressing the intent of making sure that we enter an initial case note for each participant explaining how and why the client is part of that target priority population. And then I've demonstrated that on a couple of mock example clients also. So next slide, please. Again, it's really important to understand for this alternative eligibility, it's only needed if a client does not meet the traditional WIOA dislocated worker eligibility. If somebody meets traditional dislocated worker eligibility, okay, so it sounds like everybody's having a hard time hearing me. Any better? Maybe I can disconnect and call back. Feedback.
Yeah,
Jill,
it's just like I can hear you, Jim, but it's just fuzzy.
Well, let me just hang up and try back and see if maybe it's just a bad connection.
Okay. Jill, did you want to address any of the questions while we're waiting for Jim to come back?
I was starting to talk, and of course I was on mute, sorry, but yeah, I was looking at some of the questions, and I'm looking at these, and a lot of these Jim is going to be addressing. So it's one of the questions, so you're saying that we have to co-enroll career services such as IEP. What I'm saying is that every Quest client does need to have at least one career service. If it's IEP, if it's career case management, whatever it is, every client has to have at least one. If that client starts out as 1D, they might have had 2, 3, 4, 6 career services already. They've done the IEP, they've done case management, they've done career counseling. What I'm saying is at the point, let's say next semester in January, you're going to co-enroll them in the Quest grant. Go ahead and co-enroll them, provide the training, maybe the supportive services, but also enter a career services grant. If it's case management, that seems like that would be appropriate, something, so that when we look at your information, we see that, okay, they've got 100 participants served to date, and they also have 100 people who have career services to date. So that's what my question is there. If I didn't answer that question, let me know, but that was my understanding of what you were getting at. So career services, it's that way. Quest, it's that way. I shouldn't say career services. Career DWG grant and the Quest grant, that's the same situation with both. They all have to have at least one career service. Jim, are you back with us? Because I'll be quiet if you are. And Jim can talk about the next question, self-attestation.
Can you hear me better now? Hello.
Yeah, it sounds better, Jim.
Okay, I can hear you guys better. It seems like it's really crisp now compared to earlier. So maybe it was just a bad connection. So we're having a lot of storms here in central Illinois. So I don't know if anybody else is having that problem. So maybe it's something like that also. But back to what I was speaking about before I had to disconnect and retry again. Again, when I'm speaking about this alternative eligibility criteria, it's only needed if a client does not meet any traditional dislocated worker. Anybody that meets traditional dislocated worker, they should be certified under that, and then they'll be available for the Quest enrollments. If they don't meet traditional dislocated worker, that's when the alternative eligibility criteria that's addressed in this PowerPoint would come into play. So next slide, please. So this is the screen, and it's all on the dislocated worker characteristics screen for all this alternative eligibility. There's nothing else throughout the application of WIOA is where we capture a lot of the different barriers and the information that is needed for federal reporting, and also captured for a lot of those barriers for underserved and historically marginalized. But all of our eligibility for this alternative is those middle 7 questions right on the dislocated worker characteristics screen. So next screen, please. And we put that little blurb right in the middle, and it kind of reiterates what I just spoke about, stating that those following questions are only needed for an individual who does not meet any traditional dislocated worker eligibility. One of the things I want to make clear, these questions, any one of these questions makes your client eligible. If you really think you want to be an overachiever and mark multiples, well, you just have to realize that you have to have good statements from the client or a good picture of how they meet that particular one. But it doesn't make them any more eligible if you've picked multiples, because any one makes him or her eligible. My recommendation is pick the one that's the easiest for the client to explain. Like the example, if I'd lost my job twice in the last 24 months, well, then I would pick that 3rd question and then have the client expand on that. And that would meet that eligibility. So again, just because you're answering multiples, it doesn't make the client more eligible. The point that's really clear about wanting to make them appropriate to put in this grant is not necessarily this eligibility, because many clients will meet this eligibility, but it's explaining how they are underserved and historically marginalized individuals based on the barriers that are identified in the grant agreements and in all the information that Jill's passed on, and I'll touch on here in a moment. So I want to make sure we're clear on that. So next slide, please. So the first one, it's just clearly that a client has no work history. So this is somebody maybe hasn't been in the labor force, maybe somebody that's when I say not been in the labor force, maybe it's somebody that was a stay-at-home spouse, or maybe somebody's just getting out of high school or just getting out of school and they're just starting to look to enter the workforce. Maybe some folks have been raising their children and they haven't been looking for jobs. Now they're coming back in. So again, that's somebody that does not have a job or has not had employment. So really, if you check that one, you wouldn't be appropriate to check any of the other ones anyway, because the client has no work history. And sometimes we hear people say, well, what's the documentation for that? Well, that would simply be the client attesting to his or her situation that in the past they've never worked. And that's really simple for that one there. So next slide, please. In the last 24 months, has client held or is currently holding a temporary, seasonal, or day-to-day employment job? So that's just what it is. We're looking at somebody that's not a consistent work. Think about people that are work in the lawn care business, people that are maybe roofers that works a lot in the summer, construction workers work a lot in the summer, but then are laid off in the winter or in the fall, late fall and in the colder weather. So hit a myriad of people, but that's really a broad question that a lot of folks could meet. So some of the examples that's listed: landscaping business, temp agencies, somebody work as a day worker. Again, when I see, like we have for our drop downs, we have it set up for the documentation to support that, either a work history or a self-attestation of their employment circumstances. A lot of times you might be combining both, to having them attest with their work history of situation like this. So next slide, please. In the last 24 months, has the client employment ended more than once? Just what it is. I've gotten out of the military a year ago, and then I got laid off from another job. Well, that's somebody that's employment's ended more than once in the 24 months. So if a client meets that criteria, that's their eligibility. So again, the documentation could be a combination of, could be the work history, or maybe the client could expand on it a little more if you feel it needs to be. Next slide, please. Has the client been unemployed for at least 6 of the past 13 weeks, or is unemployed and has one of the state or locally defined employment barriers? So this one, those restrictions of 6 of the last 13 weeks is one, but then the other is they just say they lose their job today. And then we're looking at some of the state or locally defined employment barriers. So go ahead and go to the next screen, and we've got those listed. It's a kind of a long laundry list. So go ahead and switch to that next screen, please. So a person could be a displaced homemaker, which really wouldn't be appropriate for this alternative criteria, because then they would be a standalone eligible person due to their dislocated worker criteria, and you wouldn't have to use the alternatives. But if somebody's low income, if somebody's race and ethnicity is Indian, Alaskan Native, or Native American, Hawaiian, and this is how they, when I say they, the client themselves state about their race and ethnicity. If a person has a disability, if a person's age 55 or older, if they're an ex-offender / justice involved individual, if they're considered homeless, if they're, well, it says a youth who have aged out of foster care, but that would also be an adult that's aged out. A lot of times, that's a barrier to employment for a person's lifetime if they were a former foster child. Individuals who are assessed as an English language learner, people that have low levels of literacy and individuals facing substantial cultural barriers. Eligible migrant and seasonal farm workers, people within 2 years of exhausting their TANF benefits, people that are single parents, and that does include a single pregnant woman. And then folks that are considered long-term unemployed, meaning they've been unemployed at least 27 consecutive weeks. So any of those are the state-defined barriers. So if somebody's laid off and they don't meet that 6 to 13 weeks, but they're just unemployed and they meet any of these criteria, that would be appropriate for that barrier. Next slide, please. The client that has been unemployed for at least 6 of the, oh, we already did that one, I believe. So on this one here, let's say we have a client that's been fired, recently fired, but again, he or she has one of those barriers that could also work. So next slide, please. A client underemployed works or needs to work multiple jobs, or is earning less than $15 an hour. We see this a lot with people. They have to work multiple jobs just because it's hard to make ends meet with their current occupation. So you see folks working a day job and then maybe working the nighttime, doing various things. So that's going to make the person meet this eligibility criteria. But also if they're working in a job making less than $15 an hour, that's also an appropriate response for a yes for this criteria. Next one. Next, for individuals who do not meet traditional dislocated worker, kind of reinforcing that, but was laid off, fired, or voluntarily left the job due to disaster / emergency reasons. There's a lot of circumstances where employers put pressure on people to wear masks all the time. And some people have breathing difficulties, weren't able to do it. So they ended up getting fired or they quit. Or there's a lot of different circumstances that could come into play here. And a lot of times when something like that happened, the employer held it against the client. Maybe they refused to give them unemployment benefits, so it didn't make them eligible for traditional dislocated worker. Well, we could use that barrier for this alternative eligibility. Next slide, please, or the last slide, or last additional criteria. Oh, we did some examples of that last one, and I kind of touched it on already. Contracted or were exposed to COVID, stay at home, quarantine, isolate due to care for a COVID impacted individual or child who's schooling at home, at-risk category folks, people who lacked access to adequate daycare, or folks who no longer felt safe in their job, in their career, at their work environment, folks whose work commute due to COVID was experienced in a change in work hours or shifts due to a reduced schedule or business operations. So those are just some examples of who might have had those circumstances. So next slide, please. And the last one, what this is for, often people who are formerly self-employed and now unemployed, they meet traditional dislocated worker for that criteria. But sometimes you get folks who their business is just going down. It's not necessarily closed, but they're now underemployed. So they own their business. They're still trying to keep going with it, but they're now considered underemployed. So that's when they can utilize this criteria. Now, again, there are opportunities under formerly self-employed, now unemployed. If a person has a history that's showing their business is going out, that they can meet a traditional dislocated worker. But if a person, again, they're trying to keep their business going and they're not willing to say their business is going to be closing, that's where this barrier or this additional criteria could be used. The next slide, please. These bottom questions, these are tied to those folks who have those disaster recovery services, who are going to do those disaster recovery employment. We have internal logic before they can enroll in the disaster recovery services. You have to have responses to these questions. The acceptable responses are not required for jobs also. So a lot of the jobs don't require these things, and those are acceptable. And again, these are only needed if you have disaster recovery employment services that your folks are trying to get into. Next slide. In cases, if you have a current, this is something that I want to give kudos to Mike Johnson from LWS 3. He sent up yesterday, I think it was, or maybe it was the day before. They have a list of folks in LWS 3 that are currently enrolled in the adult title who they're wanting to co-enroll into the Quest. And he was saying, hey, how can I do that? Because if I try to do a guided application, I get an error message saying I can't do that because the application's already been certified. Well, what we realized, and it's really a needed fix, is we need to be able to update the dislocated worker characteristic screen for anybody who you're trying to co-enroll under your Quest grant. So I've worked with the programmers and we've got the changes put in. It's just a matter of getting tested and deployed. And we're hoping to get that done next week. So I'm demonstrating what you'll do once it gets updated. If for some reason why you need to enroll somebody this week before these changes, all you need to do is send me to my email the particular person and the particular barrier you want me to populate, and I can take care of that for you. But hopefully in the real near future, you guys will be able to do this like I'm going to show in the next few slides. So next screen, please. So this is of a certified client. In this particular client, you'll see the dates. Look, their application was all the way back in June of 2021. But now it's determined we want to co-enroll this client under this disasters and emergency grant. So you simply just go into the dislocated worker characteristics screen. So next slide, please. And again, what you'll find, this is going to be needed after the deployment of these changes that are being worked on right now, but it's going to open up those questions for the alternative criteria. And then you'd simply, next slide, please. You'd simply populate the appropriate response. In this case, I put the last 24 months has client employment ended more than once. And then you'd save that screen in the next slide. And then you'd want to make sure to go and put that detailed case note explaining how that client meets the criteria as underserved and historically marginalized individual. Like in this case, the person was an adult client who was low income, basic skills deficient, but also her ethnicity was American Indian. She was a single parent, so she had multiple ways of showing how she was underserved and historically marginalized individual. So you document that case note, and the next slide, please. Then you go in and you just determine the eligibility. Now you determine the eligibility on or after 10/1/2012, because that's when you got your Quest grant. And then you're going to be able to just determine, I use today's date since I was updating this PowerPoint as of today, determine eligibility. And next slide, please. In this case, I went ahead and certified it because there's no change. The certification process is the same. It's going to carry over the documentation for the authorized to work in the United States and compliance with selective service. And then I just had to put in applicant statement or work history. And then I certified under the 1N National Dislocated Worker Grant, DWG Emergencies and Disasters. So next slide. And what happens if you go back then to that client's original dislocated worker characteristic screen, you'll now see that locked that eligibility criteria that used to support that 1N disasters emergency criteria. Next slide, please. And then now the person can go ahead and be enrolled under the 1N title under your Quest DWG. It's really important, again, you have to pick that 1N title, because what's going to happen is this people that are co-enrolled, they're going to show up both 1A as well as 1N. So in order to get the Quest grant, you'd have to pick the 1N. And then this person's only been certified up to career services. So both career and disaster recovery services show up. In order to be certified up to training, of course, they'd had to done the training certification. And that's the same steps that you'd normally do if you're certifying up to training. So next slide, please. These past 10 slides, we're just demonstrating instances where a current WIO adult or a WIO registrant is going to be co-enrolled under the 1N Quest DW. If you would need to co-enroll prior to updates being deployed to production IWDS, which we're hoping to have early next week, again, you just reach out to me and I'll be glad to assist. Next slide, please. To reiterate, for every client that will be served under the 1N Quest DWG, staff must have a detailed case note explaining how that client meets the criteria of underserved and historically marginalized. So this next slide is just the example I had on the original client in that PowerPoint I sent out. So it's nothing different, but next slide, please. And again, just explaining for that initial client, John Leo, details about how, in this case, he met the criteria of being underserved, historically marginalized individual. Next slide, please. So documentation, again, for all 7 of those alternative emergency and disaster criteria are the choices of an applicant statement and work history. However, really based on the circumstances of the situation, it could end up being both. You know, you have to pick one or the other, but a lot of times you're going to use their work history along with the client explaining if it's not clear. But I want to reiterate, if you pick multiple questions to say yes to for that alternative criteria, even though you don't need to, if people do sometimes, you need to make sure have a good documentation of how the client met each one of those. But only one makes you eligible. So if you're picking multiples, you're just wanting to be an overachiever. So you only need one to make him or her eligible. Next slide, please. So in this presentation, we covered the details around the alternative eligibility criteria that would support enrollment under the 1N National Dislocated Worker Emergencies and Disasters Career Services. We demonstrated a current WIO adult client who would like to be co-enrolled under the 1N National Emergencies and Disasters eligibility. And then we discussed the requirements around and demonstrated recording a case note for a 1N Quest DWG client, explaining how they met the criteria of underserved and historically marginalized individual. So now I think I've seen several questions, so we can address those, or Jill and I can work on them together. You want to take care of those now, Jill?
Yeah, let's go ahead. There's several that I think you're able to respond to, but yes, let's do that.
Okay.
I see
You wanna read
one
them or you want me to do them?
earlier. Would a self-attestation suffice as documentation for the laid off due to COVID, childcare, etc.?
Yep, that makes perfect sense to me. Yeah. It doesn't, the big thing is whatever you're saying yes to, or the client saying yes to, you just want to make sure you're tying that together. So that makes perfect sense. If a client had to quit his or her job because of COVID, because of childcare, then that's what they would word it. I want to reinforce, I didn't say it in this PowerPoint, but there's no need when you're using this alternative eligibility questions to have a dislocation job. All their eligibility for this alternative criteria is going to be based on those questions. So it's not like you're going to have that dislocation job. Because if you're recording an actual dislocation job, we're doing that if somebody meets the traditional dislocated worker. But again, I want to reinforce, please do not take a shortcut and say, hey, I'm not going to work with traditional dislocated worker. I can make it easy by just using one of these alternatives criteria. The alternative criteria is only for clients who do not meet traditional dislocated worker. So we want to make sure to reinforce that.
Jim, to expand on the question that you just answered, one of the questions is work history, meaning IBIZ, pay stubs.
Well, you're trying to tie together how the client meets that particular question. It's answered yes. So whatever's appropriate for when you say work history IBIZ, so the client more than likely is probably going to give you the work history, but it's all going to be based on which of those 7 questions is answered. So if it's clear, like here, I'll give you an example of work history. One of the questions is unemployed or left different job over the last 24 months, more than one job. Well, then if the person would show that in the last 24 months, like the example I gave, a person got out of the armed forces last year and then they had a job and whatever, quit or fired between the time they got out of the military. That's 2 jobs in the last 24 months. So whatever, it could be the client writing that work history. So whatever the client's getting it, but what you're wanting to do is to make sure that whatever question that's used as a yes to support the alternative, that you're tying it together so it's logical and makes sense if somebody's coming to look at your record.
Jim, there's a question. Does the term employment ended mean laid off only? That's, I think, the past 24 months, has client employment ended more than once? So the question.
Nope, it could include fired, quit, laid off, any of those. It doesn't have to. That's the reason why it's used for the alternative, because a lot of times for a traditional dislocated worker, if somebody quits or is fired, sometimes they don't get, that's when the employer fights their unemployment and they're not eligible for it. And then we have a hard time making him or her eligible as a dislocated worker. So for this alternative criteria, when it says employment ended, that could be the range of fired, quit, the person was laid off, whatever the circumstances on it. So any of those would meet that criteria.
Okay, and there was a question about justice involved individuals, which someone did answer. And yes, that's the politically correct term for it. It's ex-offender, offender, justice impacted, justice involved, justice touched. It's all the same thing, but it's somebody who's had involvement in the justice system in any way, even an arrest, not necessarily a conviction or incarceration, but an arrest record. So that's what justice involved means. As far as, there's a question here, Jim. What if the contact date is September 28th, but the eligibility date is 10/6? Can we serve the individual who's eligible for DWG?
Yes, that'll work. Yep. The big thing is your certification is going to work. If you do an application date prior to 10/1, you might see additional questions that's because there was a changeover effective 10/1, but it'll still incorporate those alternative ones. But your grant started 10/1, so you can't enroll in any services until on or after 10/1, because that's when your DWG grant or your Quest grant came. And okay. I know I've seen something pop up about the folks with LWS 7, so Career Connect. That's when you'll work with Dina. Dina has an interface with IWDS. She works with her programmers. So we'd have to, for those with LWS 7, we want to make sure you're working with Dina and Julia to make sure how they've got Career Connect alternative eligibility set up.
Thanks, Jim. There was a question about what additional updates are we waiting on for IWDS?
The only additional update we're waiting now is for those people who are trying to get co-enrolled. So if you're registered in a current adult or youth that you're wanting to put in your Quest grants, you wouldn't be able to populate those alternative questions right now. So that's when you'd contact me, tell me who the client is and which of those barriers, and I would do it for you. And then I put in a case note explaining that I did this for you. And then you guys would move forward with a case note of explaining how they meet the criteria of underserved, historically marginalized individual. And then you would just move forward and certify under the 1N emergencies and disasters. But again, after this deployment of the change goes, then you wouldn't have to contact me. You'll be able to do it yourself like was demonstrated in those later 10 slides.
Okay, thank you, Jim. We've got some questions here. I'm not sure I understand this one. When will IWDS accept the Quest eligibility elements to convert a 1A to Quest? Also, what if the individual was enrolled in June? Is there anything else we need to do due to the grant being authorized in October? I guess, Jim, you can maybe answer this, but I want to make sure that we're not moving 1A adults and 1Y youth to the Quest grant, taking them out of the 1A or 1Y grant and moving them to the Quest. That wasn't the idea. We had talked about if it makes sense to co-enroll your participants. So you've got a 1A or a 1Y, and it makes sense to add them to the Quest grant and they meet the underserved, historically marginalized. Then at the next logical break in training, for example, that would make sense to do that. But Jim, do you have something to add to that?
The biggest thing I want to make sure to reinforce is those folks will be co-enrolled, and some of the rules around co-enrollment is you can't exit from one program until you're finished with services for all. So these Quest grants have a 2-year lifespan. So let's say you have a youth client that you co-enroll under this Quest and you enroll him or her in services. That youth cannot be exited then until the services are completed with the Quest also. So that's a really important detail to think about if you're considering co-enrolling. And again, reasons to co-enroll would be maybe you're running out of funds in one or the other, but they still have to meet that criteria of underserved and historically marginalized. And many times our adults and our youth will, because a lot of times those are priority groups that meet a lot of those same criteria that meet for underserved and historically marginalized. But a big thing to really understand is if you co-enroll, you can't exit from one until they're completed in services on all. And then when they do exit, they exit together. Both types.
And performance. Yep. They're a part of performance in all categories. Then they're a part of dislocated worker performance and 1A performance, for example, or Y. They're part of all performance.
Exactly. Whatever they're enrolled in, whatever titles they're enrolled in services. So if you have a current adult client that gets co-enrolled in the Quest, well, then they're going to show up in your dislocated worker performance as well as in your adults. If you have a current youth client that you co-enroll into Quest, then it's going to show up in your youth performance and as well as your dislocated workers. So yep, that's exactly how it works.
Okay, there's a question about, is there a more in-depth definition of rural resident for historically marginalized? Boy, if you look up rural resident, if you Google that, you'll see many definitions depending on who's defining it, especially what state or federal agencies defining it. One thing you can do is to use those the criteria, the qualified census tract or the disproportionately impacted area. Beyond that, I think each LWIA, looking at their communities, can take a look at that and decide in your LWIA, what is considered rural areas. We don't have a project-wide definition for a rural resident. So you can define for your own LWIA what that means. But but make a note of that and, share that with us. But no, I don't have a in-depth definition of rural resident. Let me see if there's anything out here. Jim, do you have anything as you're reading these?
I haven't really been looking at those questions. Let me scan them real quick here.
Okay, so we're out of 1A and 1D for ITA, so that is why we want to utilize Quest. That could be fine. Again, they're going to be in performance for all the titles, whatever titles they're in. They do have to be a part of the underserved and historically marginalized. And that is part of what you're going to be reporting in your monthly report, so we can kind of gauge what's going on in terms of co-enrollment. It is definitely possible to do that, but what we want to be careful of, and like I said, what we don't want to happen is for you to be moving, you're out of youth money or you're out of adult money. And so all your, not all your clients, but many clients then are being moved to this grant. We just want to understand what's going on and to what degree. So, I guess that's all I can say about that in terms of the co-enrollment. Anybody else have any other questions? We've got a few minutes left.
One thing I'll pass on, this is Jim. If you have any questions about how IWDS, the alternative eligibility, any issues you're having, feel free to send me an email. I'll be glad to, I try to be as responsive as possible. I'm only taking off a day here or there for the holidays, so I should be able to get back with you relatively quick. So, but again, don't be afraid to reach out and just ask a question. I'd much rather have the question and get it answered than make you wonder or have you wonder about something. So.
Thanks, Jim. I'm just checking to see if there's anything else. Feel free to jump in, anybody, if we've missed your question. I'm looking at the questions that were submitted. I'm not seeing anything else.
Somebody, Patty Prado, had said, just a comment, she checked the website about the QCT DIA map and it's not working. The search location is not working. So that's just a comment Patty passed on.
Interesting. I will send that out again to make sure everybody has that. So for all your participants, you can look up, oh, false alarm, it's working now, must be the rain. Yeah, it probably is. We got some bad weather moving in. Okay, so it is important that everybody make sure all your staff who need it does have that link so you can look up the participant address and keep a record, track your numbers of people in those two groups. So thanks, Patty, for checking that.
I think James had a question about, is justice involved any part of the system, such as speeding tickets? It goes to the same definition that's in WIOA under offender, which is basically if you've been touched by any form of the judicial process that could have effect on your employment and education. So if a person, if they have multiple speeding tickets, I could see how that could be tied to. The key for capturing it as far as in IWDS, there's only the question of felon, offender, misdemeanor on the characteristics and barrier screen. So sometimes people are reluctant to answer that, but keep in mind, we're using those for good case notes to support being underserved and historically marginalized. So if you check yes to one of those, you can just explain in your case note when you're supporting underserved, historically marginalized, the circumstances of the individual.
And to expand on that, Jim was talking about the definition does talk about being subject to any stage of the criminal justice process. And then it goes further to say that the person requires assistance in overcoming artificial barriers to employment resulting from a record of arrest or conviction. So if somebody has anything on their arrest record, they could be struggling with finding a job because of it. So keep that in mind, that it's, any stage in the justice system, any barriers that they're facing because of their interaction with the justice system. Okay, anything else? I'm not seeing anything. If that's the case, jump in if you have questions, but we'll wrap this up. And I do want to thank Jim, first of all, for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us today. I appreciate that. And as Jim said, he's available for questions as questions come up, as the need arises. We'll have more of that starting next month, I think. But in the meantime, I'll be in touch in the next week or so with some of this report information in terms of the monthly status report. The weekly report we talked about, but that's not until January 1st, a quick email to me telling me the number of enrollments. But if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, email or phone, and we can just go ahead and get it addressed and figure out what's going on. So I'm not seeing any more questions. Jim, any last minute comments?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay, and Kirsten, thank you very much for hosting us and running this. We do appreciate it. So I guess we will go ahead and sign off. So thanks everybody for participating today. We do appreciate it, and have a very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and I guess we'll probably be talking next year.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye everybody.
Bye-bye.